a co-production of Oregon Public Broadcasting and Oregon Health Forum.
Major funding for Taking the Pulse provided by Northwest Health Foundation, the community's partner for better health.
Hello, I'm Andrew Holtz, and welcome to Taking the Pulse. This program is about health, but not about the latest pill to treat your aches and pains. We're taking a broader view because our health is interwoven with so many other things in our lives. Certainly when you get sick, you want to have the best medicine. But to stay healthy, we need to pay attention to how things are going on with family, on the job, at school, and in our community. In this half hour, we'll be face-to-face with a killer of young Oregonians, a killer our community often refuses to recognize: suicide. Did you know that suicide is more common than murder? In fact, suicide is the second leading cause of death for Oregonians aged 10 to 24. Suicide claims about 75 young lives each year in Oregon, but 10 times that many are treated in hospital emergency rooms after suicide attempts. And on average, if you spoke honestly with a typical classroom full of 30 students in an Oregon high school, 5 would admit seriously considering suicide within the last year. Those are some of the statistics. Let's meet some of the people. Chris Johnson played hockey in tournaments around the West, built a website using advanced computer skills, and he wrote poetry. When he was 14, Chris Johnson died in a park just down the street from his home.
He shot himself.
Chris's mother, Nancy Johnson, is a survivor. In the language of suicide, a survivor is someone left behind.
I had no clue. I did not have the slightest idea that him killing himself would even be an option.
Nancy Johnson helped establish the Northwest chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, so other parents would know.
We do suicide prevention awareness presentations, and we do them for adult groups, for PTAs, groups of teachers, counselors, church groups. Whoever would like to see us, we'd like to get our message out to them.
That message includes the warning signs of suicide, including the link to unrecognized or undertreated depression and where to turn for help. And Nancy Johnson tells of her son, Chris, who pushed himself to try memorizing the multiplication tables before his first day of kindergarten, how he declined medication when he showed signs of depression in 6th grade, and how he told internet chat friends he was thinking of suicide, but didn't tell his family. Chris left behind a bit of his poetry.
True shadows fall during our night of emptiness, our night of dry, grieving tears. Tears blinked from the fluorescent black eye of the night, the eye which lies unseen. Night falls, covering up the strangled, faded shadows, fading them away, away into our blackness of the night, the inevitable night, the endless night.
Jay Johnston is nearly blind, and he barely resembles the high school varsity football lineman in his old team pictures.
As a senior in high school, I was preparing to go off to college. I had a job, friends, everything seemed to be going okay, but still things were so hopeless. I always felt depressed, I always felt sad and alone. I felt it was a dread.
Despite medical treatment for attention deficit and depression that began in 2nd grade, Jay says a cloud hung over everything.
I would anticipate things that I thought would be fun, and I wouldn't allow myself to have fun. I wouldn't allow myself to be happy.
On Memorial Day weekend 4 years ago, just after his 18th birthday and right before graduation, Jay was tired of fighting. He called friends but didn't reach anyone. Jay put a shotgun to his face and pulled the trigger.
A friend that I had paged eventually called me back, and my mother who was home at the time but didn't hear the gunshot, came down to my room to tell me I had a phone call and found me lying on the floor.
Months of hospitalization and rehab followed. Physically, Jay's life is tougher now, but on the inside, he says things are better. He's in his second year at Portland State studying business and economics. His depression is not gone, but he says with help from a counselor and medication, he's better at dealing with the awful feelings.
I hope my story and appearance scare people into realizing how potentially dangerous depression left unattended can become.
So that perhaps others won't walk through gunfire trying to get to the other side. Joining us now are three people whose lives have been touched by suicide. First off is Bev Cobain, who's a psychiatric nurse and got involved with this because of suicides in her family, including cousin Kurt Cobain. Right. We also have Nancy Johnson, who lost a child to suicide, and Jay Johnston, who himself came very close to losing his own life to suicide. If somebody's out there watching now who's either thinking about suicide or friends who maybe have heard someone talk about suicide, what should those people do? What would you want them to do?
Seek professional help, whether it be a school counselor or the first step might even be talking to the friend's parent or their parent for advice, a teacher, anyone. It's the most important thing is just to not keep the person's situation a secret. It's often deadly, and you're really doing the person a disservice or yourself a disservice by keeping it a secret and not telling anyone. If that person can't help, keep looking. Keep telling people, keep looking for help.
Were you telling any of your friends to keep things a secret? Do you think anyone understood how badly you were feeling?
No, I didn't tell anyone. I kept my feelings to myself. Until the very end, I didn't know how dire my situation was, and at the end, I felt bad enough that I thought that killing myself would be a more attractive option than living with the pain that I'd been feeling. Mm-hmm. But no, I didn't tell anyone. If someone had asked, I probably would have told them, which I think is important, that if you're worried about someone, to breach the question, because I don't think I would have lied. I would have told them the truth, but I didn't want to tell anyone, partly because I didn't want to seem like I was crying wolf or seeking attention. I don't know if that sounds silly or not, but that's how I felt. I guess I was partly ashamed of how I felt and how depressed I was. Like I should have been able to handle it and not been so sad.
Nancy, as we saw in the taped segment, you have lost a child to suicide. What do you want other parents to know about how to try to prevent that kind of loss happening to them?
Well, I think first of all, people need to know that untreated, undertreated, or misdiagnosed depression has a 15% mortality rate by suicide. And so it's very important to treat and treat well any kind of depression that a child might have. Depression rates seem to be going up and up and being discovered in younger and younger kids. So it's when you see symptoms, don't think, oh, that child is too young for depression. Have it explored by a professional.
Bev Cobain, you're the cousin of a very famous name for some good things and some unfortunate things. Kurt Cobain was your cousin, and You've had other family members who committed suicide, and you're professionally trained as a psychiatric nurse. You've brought those things together now, the family connection and your professional education. How are you trying to make a difference? What do you think are the messages that need to get out there about suicide?
The first thing I did following Kurt's death was to sort of understand that with 3 suicides in my family, and having been treated for depression myself, that there was really something to the connection between depression and suicide. And so I started looking at all the teens who were contacting me after Kurt's death and realized that teens needed some resources. And they needed to start talking about depression, and that the people who care for them and about them needed to be aware of what those signs and symptoms were. So I think the first step I took was writing the book, When Nothing Matters Anymore, which was written directly to teens to help them try to sort out what their feelings were. And then since then, that's just opened up a lot of the work that I do. I travel and speak, and mostly my role is to teach people to be aware of signs of depression and to learn to ask the question, are you thinking of suicide? And to listen and show compassion, and then to get help.
Yeah. There is so often secrecy around this issue, and when your cousin, who was a rock and roll star and well known to a lot of young people, committed suicide, that was a point at which young people were talking about suicide. Is it your experience, your understanding though, that suicide is something that young people do talk about, that it's not avoided by them?
They don't avoid it, but the problem is who they talk to about it. They will talk to their friends about it, but they will not normally talk to an adult. So a lot of the focus of what we do in Washington and what they're starting to do in Oregon is to teach students that they can really save lives if they know what the signs are, to not just listen to somebody complain, but to actually help them to try to get help. Mm-hmm. Because the irony is that right when kids most need help, they are not able to actually ask for it. So the rest of us need to be able to see what's going on and do something about it.
Yeah, now, suicide certainly weighs heavily on families, but it also is a problem for the broader society, and let's take a look at what schools and other parts of society may be able to do about it.
Break time is ending at Jesuit High, a Catholic school in Portland. Students here get a solid education, and many are from well-off families. Yet, as in every school, suicide is a concern.
My freshman year, one of my friends committed suicide. And it was a hard thing for me because I didn't think he would do that, because he was a good kid and he was always outgoing and funny and such. And so that really got me thinking.
Although Jesuit has not lost a student to suicide during her years here, Activity Director Elaine Ford says they make a point of reaching out to students.
So we've found out about a lot of kids who are just depressed and get some help.
And if my friends or family would have
On this morning, suicide is the topic of a talk by Scott Kirkland. The recent graduate from the University of Portland recalls one day in grade school when he was racing home and ran right past his friend Jeremy.
And he says, "Scott, stop, wait. I gotta talk to you." And I just kept running, and I said, I merely even faltered my stride, and I said over my left shoulder, "I don't have time." And I'd forgotten about Jeremy until I learned of his death that night.
His senior year in high school, Scott says he began thinking of suicide.
Get out, ease your pain, ease everybody else's. No one cares that you're here. And so I started planning my suicide. And I didn't have a specific day. Today is going to be the end of my day. No. I was just waiting for a bad day, a day that didn't come out right.
Then he saw a newspaper article about the warning signs of teen suicide and recognized himself.
Has trouble eating or sleeping? Me. Drastic changes in behavior? Me. Withdraws from family or friends? Me.
Scott urged the students here to listen for the warning signs within themselves and their friends, and to reject suicide as an option for dealing with pressure and problems.
You guys have been an excellent audience. Thank you.
I looked around the room and everybody was listening to him.
This guy talked for an hour and he kept my focus the whole time.
It hit home.
While schools are on the front lines of youth suicide, teachers and counselors are not always the first ones to see trouble.
First of John is no one valid.
For Grants Pass Police Lieutenant Joe Henner, a radio call often means trouble, sometimes a potential suicide.
And they either tell a friend, a neighbor, perhaps they'll call a family member, and eventually the phone call ends up through 911 and we end up at the residence or wherever it might be.
Lieutenant Henner remembers one young man on the edge.
In one single day, he was terminated from his job and his car was repossessed, and he got a hold of a firearm and indicated to some loved ones that he wanted to commit suicide. We responded, and I negotiated with him via telephone and essentially tried to show him some of the positive things in life and the things that are out there that he had to look forward to.
Hi, Gary.
Lieutenant Henner knows what to do in part thanks to training arranged by Josephine County Health Manager Gary McConaughey. So far, McConaughey has helped put more than 1,000 Oregonians through the ASSIST training. ASSIST stands for Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training. Developed in Canada, it's sort of a mental health CPR.
In ASSIST, what we're trying to do is get people to recognize that suicide's out there, how to recognize suicide, how to assess the degree of risk, and then to keep the person alive until the appropriate level of help can be summoned.
Good afternoon, Mental Health.
Health Department receptionist Denise LaTerrar also took the ASSIST course.
It's making us more confident that when you took a call, you can deal with it if you have to.
The folks who seem to get the most out of the ASSIST training are the ones who are furthest from being mental health professionals. The people who have some wisdom and some caring and plain common sense knowledge and want to learn some special skills.
Whether they are parents, coaches, police, anyone at all, the goal is to have one ASSIST trainee for every dozen Oregonians, so that when it comes to suicidal thoughts, just as with CPR for heart attacks, there will be someone nearby who knows what to do. And joining us now are three professionals who work partly in the area of suicide. Dr. Gary McConaughey, we just saw a little bit about the ASSIST program. You work with the Josephine County Mental Health Department. Ron Bloodworth, you were at the Oregon Health Division. And Dr. Kirk Wolf, who is president of the Oregon Council on Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Thanks very much for joining us today. Dr. McConaughey, back to the ASSIST program. We brought up the analogy of CPR. That's something that people feel very comfortable with now for dealing with a physical problem, with a heart attack. Can the same thing really work? Can anybody on the street be someone who intervenes when there's potentially a suicide?
Absolutely. Suicide is very common in our culture, and with a little bit of training and a little bit of practice, anybody can learn to successfully recognize and reduce suicide risk.
So it's not something that someone who's considering suicide is just bent on doing that. You think they really can be turned in a different direction?
Well, I'm really convinced that people who kill themselves don't kill themselves because they want to be dead, but because they no longer want to live the way they've been living. It's a very uncomfortable feeling that people want to talk about if given the opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And just any average person can get involved?
Absolutely. We found that most people who think about killing themselves do tell somebody, but not usually a mental health professional. So what we're trying to do is train as many people as we can to recognize suicide and feel comfortable and competent to asking about suicide and how the person might do it, and then know how to bridge to an ongoing source of help. Mm-hmm. Anybody can do it.
Okay, great. Ron Bloodworth, what is the state doing? A new report came out recently about suicide. What's that all about?
Yes, well, we have a statewide plan for youth suicide prevention that came out in December of last year, and now we are in the process of conducting a series of community forums around the state to disseminate the plan, to educate people about the plan, and to begin the process of mobilizing communities and addressing this serious issue in our state.
So more discussion, more public discussion is useful?
Absolutely. One of the things that I always say when I present is suicide prevention is everybody's business. And the statewide plan is a framework for communities to address this issue. And there is a role for everyone in the community to play, from teachers, to soccer coaches, to youth pastors, to professionals in the community who staff crisis lines, and to psychiatrists and other professionals who deal with these issues.
Dr. Wolf, for somebody out there, I've heard a couple of folks say, yeah, get involved. How do you know when somebody might be thinking about suicide?
I think it's really important to focus on the warning signs of suicide, and in particular, signs of depression. As Jay and Nancy and Bev have talked about, there's a very clear connection between teenagers being depressed and being much more likely to die by suicide. It's important to recognize that depression is a medical illness, that there are definite changes in brain chemistry that influence how teenagers think, how they feel, and how their body functions. I want parents, teachers, and other adults to recognize the surface signs of depression when teenagers are acting out, when they're failing in school, when they're being very irritable or withdrawing from others, when they are having legal problems, when they are skipping school, when they may be smoking, turning to drugs or alcohol, that these are surface signs of depression. And I want them to go a step further and to look for underlying causes, and that should be done through a mental health professional.
How much should any of you gentlemen want to chime in on the stigma around suicide? Even when it happens, people don't talk about it. If you start asking family members, they say, oh yeah, it happened in my family too. Go to the next one, happened in my family too. And yet you don't hear it talked about. People don't know it's happening more often than homicide. Why is that? What's going on with that?
Well, I would suggest that for some folks, the idea of dying by suicide is different from any other kind of death, in that the person has brought something upon themselves. I think people are afraid to ask about suicide because there's a mythology that if you ask about it, you're putting an idea in somebody's head, so there's a certain danger there. And we also know that people who lose loved ones to suicide, we call them suicide survivors, are individuals who sometimes have difficulty relating to other people who have lost people through other forms of death. And it takes a special listening and a special atmosphere to let people recognize that suicide is very common and is very treatable, and everybody can do something about it.
Now, certainly in most cases, a child who attempts suicide doesn't complete it and does survive. And in those cases, the first place he or she may be taken is a hospital emergency room.
Too often, an emergency room is the first place that a person thinking of suicide is seen by medical experts.
We're seeing people after the problem. It's already been identified, and in some cases it may even be too late. Either the children are very depressed or they may have tried suicide already.
Clinical psychologist Paul Guastadisegne, along with neurosurgeon Ed Newalt and others, say all their medical training and experience and society's vast investment in hospitals and trauma care cannot alone staunch the flow of suicide. When a patient arrives with a gunshot wound to the head, Dr. Newalt says there's usually little he can do, and that angers him.
The amount of handgun injury, intentional handgun injury among teenagers was not something I wanted to deal with the rest of my life.
These doctors and others are trying to follow the chain of events back to the beginning to find out why a patient ended up in an ambulance racing to their ER door.
Because they were in a car accident, for example, but they were drinking, and they were drinking because they'd been very depressed. And the identifying incident is a motor vehicle crash and alcohol. And so it's just someone who is out drinking and being reckless, but really the underlying behavior is depression and some underlying suicidal intent.
Guastadisegne says when he's called to check a patient's mental state, he often discovers no one has ever asked the patient about suicide or depression. He says pediatricians and other primary care doctors should include a few basic questions in regular checkups to learn what's going on in the patient's mind as well as body. But Dr. Newalt also stresses that the method of a suicide attempt makes a difference. Overdoses usually don't kill. Guns usually do. Of the legions of gunshot wounds he's seen, one boy sticks in his memory.
There is one kid who lived in the neighborhood that I lived in that came into the emergency room and got his hands on his parents' handgun, which was under their pillow, and put it right here. Fortunately, it didn't kill him, but it basically destroyed his entire face.
Dr. Newalt wants guns away from where kids can reach them in moments of despair. These doctors dream of reducing suicide deaths by half by acting on published suicide prevention recommendations. They say that's a far greater impact than they can make simply waiting at the hospital for the next ambulance to arrive.
So clearly something needs to be done before a young person ends up in a hospital. And that means institutions outside the hospital need to think about how they can get involved. Back to you, Sue Eastgard. You're from the state of Washington and you're director of a program up there. Tell us a little bit about what Washington State is doing now to try to prevent suicide.
We're now in our 6th year of implementing a state plan, and the 3 primary initiatives that we're implementing are related to public education, training, and then the 3rd being enhancing crisis response services. So simply put, we're trying to raise awareness that suicide is a problem. We're trying to train those who are working on the front lines with teens to recognize the warning signs. And we're trying to improve the quality of responsiveness of those people who are answering a hotline or who are responding to children, youth, and parents who are in crisis over this issue.
We have with us now an Oregon State Legislator, Representative Vicki Walker. Thank you for joining us. What's the mood in Oregon? Can this state make a similar kind of investment in suicide prevention?
Well, we hope so. We hope we can get there. Unfortunately, Oregon is experiencing significant economic downturn. We're about $700 million in the red, so no new programs are being allowed this session. I would encourage Oregonians to contact their state representative and state senator and let them know how important suicide prevention is to them, because it's ultimately your constituents who determine what it is that you focus your attention on. If you're not hearing from the silent majority, then your issue is not going to be heard or funded. So it's very important for citizens of this state to stand up and be heard and stop making suicide a secret. It really is something to talk about. It's something I went on the record about years ago. I attempted suicide when I was 17. Today, I'm state representative and I'm making change, and life does get better, and we have made significant improvements in the last 25 years in combating this issue, but Oregon still has a long way to go.
I'd like to add too that oftentimes people, I think, are afraid to ask the suicide question, are you thinking of suicide, in part because they're not really sure what to do if the answer is yes. And I think parents and kids and other professionals in the communities need to know that there's always some place to turn. The front of the phone book will always list the local available crisis line. Every county in California has a requirement to have a 24-hour crisis response availability. And a local emergency room can also be a great resource in those situations where you feel like suicide is imminent. So it's not only asking the suicide question, but being willing to hear the word, yes, I am thinking of suicide, and then knowing what to say and do to take care of the problem right then and there.
And it's really simple. As you were pointing out, it's just simple. If the answer is yes, just show compassion and get help. It's that simple. Anybody can do it.
Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for joining us on Taking the Pulse. If you need help right now, you can dial this toll-free number, 1-800-SUICIDE. That's 1-800-784-2433. If you're interested in learning more about preventing teen suicide and what you can do to participate, visit our website, www.takingthepulse.org. And there you'll find information both on this program and links to the various agencies and organizations we've featured in this program. Thank you again. I'm Andrew Holtz.
Major funding for Taking the Pulse provided by Northwest Health Foundation, the community's partner for better health.